During the early stages of the Cold War, and before the advent of guided missiles, the West had to rely heavily upon jet-powered fighters to ward off Soviet bombers. For some time, the only effective armament for these fighters were barrages of unguided missiles.
One of the changes that took place in the 1950s involved air-to-air weapons. It had been traditional until then that combat airplanes would carry machine guns or cannons. And everyone knew and everyone said that fighters need guns, except when they didn't say that. And they didn't say that when they were talking about defending the United States against bomber attack. They designed several types of interceptors that used partly or entirely unguided air-to-air rocket projectiles.
At first, each interceptor would just have one opportunity to fire in a gunshot approach with a weapon from a bygone war. The B-29 was more expensive to develop than the atom bomb. It was so complex to build that some manufacturers are said to have taken on other projects just to avoid being selected to assemble this most advanced flying machine. Even Boeing didn't really want the task of building their own creation. In the end, the Army Air Force took over much of the management, although Boeing, Bell and Martin still had to deliver. The B-29 was cloaked in secrecy throughout its early development. Occasionally details were released, but this was really disinformation to confuse the enemy, who by 1944 had seen enough of the superfortress to fear its destructive capability. In one such subterfuge, a single B-29 was landed near London to convince the German High Command that many other B-29s were to follow. The result was that Germany took extensive precautions to counter the superfortress, although none were necessary as the United States never planned to attack Germany with B-29s. The war against the Japanese Empire was a very different matter. Japan was the target that the superfortress was conceived and built to attack. Rushed into service, many early B-29s flew over Japan with technical problems, particularly with engines overheating. One safe haven for a damaged and struggling superfortress was the Soviet port of Vladivostok. At this time, Russia was not a combatant with Japan. In fact, it was technically a neutral power that could not give support to either the United States or Japan. At least 3 B-29s were forced to land in Vladivostok. They were promptly seized, repaired, and flown to Moscow. Just before the Japanese surrendered, Russia declared war on Japan, which made them a US ally in the Pacific. But Russia still refused to return the 3 B-29s. American wisdom was that a superfortress would be technically too sophisticated for Soviet engineers to replicate. And that view prevailed for several years, even as the Soviet relationship deteriorated from ally to enemy. However, in 1947, at Moscow's annual Aviation Day parade, 3 B-29s appeared overhead. At first, Western observers assumed they were American, but opinion quickly changed when a 4th identical aircraft appeared. Soviet engineers had obviously developed a clone. This was bad news on the aviation front, but worse still was the knowledge that the Soviets had for some time breached Western security and had gained access to atomic secrets. The Los Alamos project alone had at least 3 Soviet spies in its workforce. In August 1949, the Soviets, in an exercise known as First Lightning, detonated their first atomic bomb. The news shocked the West. Soviet possession of the atom bomb and the means to deliver it demanded an effective response. However, most Western air forces at the time were still flying fighters from World War II. Anticipating the nuclear threat, in 1946 a new air defense command had been formed for the aerial protection of the continental United States. At first, the ADC had to rely upon a stalwart Second World War night fighter, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The aircraft offered some radar capability, long-range and all-weather endurance, but most important of all, it was available. Later, an unusual derivative of the successful P-51 Mustang, the P-82 Twin Mustang, was pressed into service. The original P-82 was envisioned as an escort fighter. It was fitted with radar and served as an ADC interceptor. However, neither of these aircraft had the speed of a jet, and they relied upon machine guns or cannons, neither of which were likely to be very effective against a B-29, wherever it was built. Having designed the Superfortress in the first place, the US knew only too well its defensive capability. The task of successfully downing a B-29 had been given to German engineers some years earlier, when the Nazi hierarchy were tricked into believing that superfortresses would be used over Germany. The Wehrmacht's answer came in the form of the A4M rocket. The rocket had been developed from an artillery missile of slightly less than 3 inches diameter and had 8 folding fins. These would be fired in a salvo at an oncoming American bomber. The salvo approach was necessary because the rockets lacked accuracy. Allied intelligence had been aware of the A4M's devastating effect when they hit a target, especially when coupled with the speed of an Me-262. Against this arrangement, the Allies had no answer.
One of the weapons that really, I think, would have been a very frightening thing if it had gone much further was the Me-262 armed with the R4M rocket missiles. Now, they had 2 batteries or 2 racks of 12 in each wing, and they were used right at the end of the war. Not in a great deal, but when they struck a bomber, it wasn't a question of damaging it or downing it, it was a question of disintegrating the entire thing. It was, a hit was total destruction.
The technology was really quite basic. In the 262's case, the launch platforms were basically carved out of wood. Other German interceptors using the A4M were fired from a simple metal tube nicknamed the stovepipe. Apart from the A4M's motor, the only other technology it employed was its folding fins, which snapped open after launch. FW-190s and Me-262s were adapted to use Germany's new rocket defense. However, there was one aircraft that was built around the A4M. Extremely ambitious and reflecting the desperate state of the Third Reich, the Bachem Natter's sole reason for existence was to deliver the deadly folding fin rocket. The Natter used a chemical-driven Walter rocket as its main motor. 4 solid-fueled rocket power plants aided its vertical takeoff. Bachem's design only flew on one occasion and killed its young pilot in the process. But knowing of its deadly potential, Allied ground troops were to prioritize the capture of anything to do with the A4M. Fast forward to 1949. NATO gives Russia's clone nuclear bomber the codename Bull. By this time, some of America's first-generation Air Defense Command jets were close to delivery. Many of them were developed for use with two valuable assets that would help reduce the Soviet threat. Firstly, the US had improved on the A4M concept with the introduction of a four-finned 2.75-inch rocket that would ultimately be named Mighty Mouse, after the popular cartoon character of the time.
Quite a few of the aircraft projects in the 1950s did away with the gun. It was thought the gun, and in other words close-in fighting, was no longer required. It would be air-to-air missiles. But you can only carry a small number of missiles at a time. And so an alternative to the gun was the unguided rocket. In America, the version was known as the Mighty Mouse.
Airborne radar was also coming of age. First employed at the end of World War II, it was now ready for use in conjunction with ground radar. Radar was particularly important when employing fighters known as interceptors, as they are required to fly at night and in all weather conditions. In 1945, the US Army Air Force was preparing to enter the jet age and had asked for submissions for a jet-powered night fighter to replace the propeller-driven aircraft it then had in service. A serious contender for this contract was the Nighthawk, a four-engined dual-seat interceptor from the Curtiss-Wright Company. The Nighthawk's failure to perform in flight tests in 1948 led to the demise of the Curtiss-Wright Company. Instead, Air Defense Command chose a contender from Northrop. The F-89 Scorpion had two engines for safety and dual seats, one for a dedicated radar operator. The Scorpion was to be equipped with cannons because Mighty Mouse was not yet available. Delays in delivery of the F-89s had the advantage of enabling them all to be fitted with folding fin rockets. In fact, the Scorpion could carry 102 of the rockets.
The F-89, which was quite an interesting aircraft with big rocket pods out on the end of the wing, and pretty heavy aircraft, but the usual case that we've done in so many of our aircraft, by the time we get through hanging things on them, they're all underpowered. and the F-89 didn't last long, but it was one of the airplanes in the air defense development that took place as we moved into the Cold War time frame and our expectations that we might have to fight Russia.
However, late delivery of the F-89s at this very sensitive time in history led Air Defense Command to order two other interceptors as immediate backup. Lockheed calculated that they could convert the T-33 trainer to a two-seat interceptor using up to 75% of the Tu-33's parts, a major saving in money, and more importantly, time. ADC was very impressed as the first flight of the XF-94 was made just 3 months after the contract was signed. The latest C version of the Starfire carried Mighty Mouse rockets just as they were starting to become available. The second backup for the Scorpion was a North American aviation project. The company's F-86 Sabre had been a major step forward in fighter design, but it was primarily a dogfighter, not an interceptor. But North American believed that the basic frame could be converted into the interceptor role. In the event, only about 25% of the original F-86 parts were used to make the F-86D or Sabre Dog. Nevertheless, their unit cost was around 1/3 of the twin-engine Scorpion. Nearly all the 2,800 F-86Ds that rolled out of North American's plant were armed with the Mighty Mouse rocket. Like the Nazis' Bachem Natter Interceptor rocket, it existed solely for the purpose of delivering 2.75-inch folding fin rockets.
The F-86D didn't have any guns. The F-86D Sabre carried a tray of these rockets under the pilot. The tray had to be extended, then the rockets could be fired.
There was another interceptor that would be armed with the folding fin projectile, the Canadian CF-100.
We had 2 rocket pods, 29 rockets each, and so there's 58 total, and it was a one-shot effort. So when you were into a bomber stream and locked onto the bomber, you would fire these things off, and it was essentially a shotgun type approach. You're bound to hit something. One rocket would do the job.
Of course, it's all.
Canada's Arctic region required an all-weather aircraft. Like the Scorpion and the Starfire, the CF-100 had a 2-seat configuration with a dedicated radar operator in the rear. Working in conjunction with a string of early warning radar posts, almost 700 CF-100s were built. They served for almost 30 years. So important was the project that Avro Canada cancelled its promising early jet airliner design to concentrate on its rocket-firing defender of North America. Eventually, Mighty Mouse rockets were superseded by supersonic surface-to-air missiles like the Boeing Bomark. Army Nike shorter-range anti-aircraft missiles took over much of the air defense role in the mid to late 50s. Air Defense Command did retain the use of some Mighty Mouse rockets on its new generation interceptor, the F-102 Dagger, but only as support for the Falcon-guided missile, which was the Dagger's primary weapon. As guided missile technology improved, the Mighty Mouse was no longer able to compete for a spot on board US interceptors.
The unguided rockets, they didn't have very much range, they were unguided, and of course the moment you fired them they were under the effect of gravity, so actually getting them to accurately hit a target, anything beyond a very short distance, was really not much chance. And so needless to say, by the 1960s this weapon wasn't carried very often at all.
During the Vietnam War, the 2.75-inch rocket was paired with armed helicopters, and it was reborn as a ground attack weapon. Literally millions of Mighty Mouse rockets were launched against North Vietnamese targets from a wide range of US rotary and fixed-wing aircraft. Specialized warheads could be fitted onto the rockets depending on their intended end use, be it anti-personnel, anti-tank, or basic target marking. During the Gulf War, the Apache helicopters that opened the air campaign by destroying 2 Iraqi radar sites with Hellfire missiles also carried Hydra 70 rockets, the modern-day incarnation of the Mighty Mouse. The folding fin rocket was born out of the Reich's desperate need to stop the flow of Allied bombers devastating its territory. When faced with the possibility of nuclear annihilation by Soviet bombers, the US grabbed onto this German weapon and adapted it into their own Mighty Mouse. Those surface-to-air missiles and air-to-air missiles would relieve the Mighty Mouse of its intended mission of knocking down Soviet bombers, the folding fin rocket would find new life as a ground attack weapon, a mission it still carries out to this day.
.163, as I said, was a tool of desperation with a poor operational record, and I consider its contribution to aviation was that it had so many innovatory features on it. But strangely enough, at the end of the war, it was the aircraft that influenced world aviation thinking more than any other unit. The Me-262 is a great contribution again, quantum jump in performance. It took us into a new era of high speed. It was a beautiful airplane to fly, but it had very, very sensitive jet engines, and they were temperamental. And when they were acting correctly, you had a great airplane on your hands. When they were temperamental, you had quite a difficult airplane on your hands. Ju-88 was outstanding aircraft. As I described the three top British, the Germans had three top ones. These were the Focke-Wulf 190, the Ju-88, and the Messerschmitt 262. Ju-88 was asked to do a multitude of things, many, many roles. It excelled in every one of them, and in one form was actually faster than Germany's fastest fighter, piston engine fighter, let's say. So I had the highest respect for it.
With America and the Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, both sides are eager to acquire the technology that will give them a distinct advantage over the other. Bombers, missiles, nuclear-powered submarines and satellites launched into space are all highly sought after during a period where the entire world could be obliterated with the flip of a switch. During this weapons race, Nazi scientists are brought over to both sides of the curtain, where the weapons that at one time were to be used against them are studied and developed further in order to produce a checkmate against the opposing power. The names Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger and Hermann Oberth are usually mentioned when this topic in history is discussed. For it is their work that gives the United States the X-15, a rocket-powered plane that reaches the edges of outer space and holds the world record for speed, flying at over Mach 6. The X-20 Dynamic Soarer, a futuristic space plane that is to be used for multiple purposes, including the bombing of the Soviet Union from outer space. Designs demonstrating America's commitment to be the undisputed champion of Cold War weaponry. And while the names von Braun and Dornberger are etched in stone as the architects of American ingenuity, there is another scientist who is often overlooked by writers and historians. His name is Dr. Eugen Sanger, a brilliant theoretician who has bigger dreams and aspirations than all the others combined. His ultimate goal is to produce a hypersonic spacecraft that can take passengers around the globe in mere hours. He has a concept that Nazi Germany desires to convert into a lethal weapon to be used against the United States. An idea that is resurrected from the ashes of the Second World War to be used as a game changer for whoever can master its concept. This is the story of Dr. Eugen Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen. The story of Eugen Sanger begins at the turn of the century in the nation of Austria, where as a young child he is infatuated with the idea of man landing on the moon. Like many others from his generation, the idea of space travel galvanizes Sanger, who reads as much science fiction as he can acquire during his impressionable youth. One book in particular that captivates Sanger is Hermann Oberth's Die Rakete zu den Planetenraumen, or By Rocket into Planetary Space, a prolific blueprint of ideas.
He read the books by Hermann Oberth and all the other space travel books. Most of them were science fiction, but that's how he got interested in space travel, going to the moon, going to Mars, and beyond.
There was a lot of great scientists there with fantastic ideas, futuristic ideas. I mean, even Werner von Braun, who did the V2. I mean, his ideas were way ahead of anybody else.
Studying civil engineering at the University of Technology in Graz, he acquires his PhD in what would now be called rocket science. Sanger is a true rocketeer who, like others, must adapt to the new regime that is taking control of Germanic lands. During a period of intense military build-up, where Austria would soon be incorporated into the Third Reich, Sanger begins work on his magnum opus, a high-speed transport plane called Silbervogel, or Silverbird.
It was his idea in the 30s, mid to late 30s, to build a high-speed passenger aircraft that could fly from Berlin to Tokyo in a matter of hours, or fly from Berlin to New York City in a matter of hours. It had nothing to do with a military aircraft. It had nothing to do with a suborbital rocket bomber. So the Silverbird started out in Eugen Sanger's mind as a high-speed, high-altitude passenger plane. It's almost similar, I guess the idea would be similar to the Concorde.
When you watch a rocket, when you watch a Saturn V or any rocket take off, you notice it takes off slowly and gradually gathers speed. Well, this is because the most energy in that is involved. More energy than any other aspect of that flight is involved in takeoff. So if you could find a way to make that ramjet, this huge ramjet engine and this huge bomber, take off without using any onboard fuel, you'd really have something there.
There was a debate among the German and Austrian rocket enthusiasts about whether you would use a pure rocket to launch you into space or whether you would use some combination of the airplane and the rocket, using a winged vehicle. So his Silverbird was an idea that he had, was one of many iterations of an idea for this kind of hypersonic or even orbital rocket plane.
It is a revolutionary concept. A vehicle capable of taking passengers from Berlin to Tokyo in mere hours by bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere.
Gravity would eventually want to pull it down. And so what Sanger would do, he'd fire up his 100-ton rocket engine, and he would dive down to about 25 miles altitude, where there's a very dense layer of atmosphere. Now, once this aircraft hit that dense atmosphere, it would bounce off of that, and it would be reflected back up again. It'd be like a child throwing a flat stone across a lake. It bounces along, skipping along. That would be the same principle for Sanger's Silver rocket.
Eugen Sanger developed a concept where you would launch a bomber, a manned bomber, into the stratosphere, into the high reaches, near reaches of space. And then you would re-enter the atmosphere and bounce back up and bounce back down, up and down. And they calculated that you could easily circle the world doing this with their 20-ton thrust Sanger ramjet engine.
While Sanger is not a man of war, his nation is on a path to war.
With all of these guys, you face the same issue that they are space enthusiasts, but they're also nationalists. They're also, in some cases, quite Nazi in their beliefs. So there was no contradiction between their space enthusiasm and being asked to work on rockets as weapons. They saw, on the one hand, rocket weapons, whether it be rocket plane or pure missile, as duty, contribution to the nation, contribution to the Third Reich. At the same time, they saw it as a stepping stone to going into space. So they really didn't see much of a contradiction, if any, at all, between the two.
And very soon, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, a man who will be responsible for Germany's aerial arsenal against the Allies, begins to take a serious look at the possibility of turning the Silbervogel into a deadly state-of-the-art weapon.
The Third Reich was only interested in weapons. The space ideas are all very nice and exotic, but they funded Sanger, they funded von Braun and others because they wanted weapons. They were out to conquer the world, and they needed the weapons to do it.
Although the United States presents itself as a neutral nation, their President Franklin Roosevelt is sympathetic to the nations of England and France. And as the 1930s come to a close, it is almost inevitable that America will enter the war one way or the other. Unfortunately for the Nazis, there is no available aircraft in their arsenal capable of reaching the United States and back to deliver a fatal blow. By 1939, the best means available is Germany's U-boat fleet, who, when given the call, will engage in unrestricted submarine warfare against America's shores. Traditional aircraft, known as the Amerika bombers, are being designed and built on the fatherland during the war, but remain a giant question mark in terms of range and payload. In a country with a fascination for wonder weapons, spending enormous sums of money on ideas and concepts that in the end may not be realistic at all, it is only natural that Sanger's grand vision is given the green light by German war planners.
When he started working for the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s, I think he looked for a way to sell this idea. The Silverbird was supposed to be a skip bomber, a hypersonic vehicle that would be launched probably from a sled. It would go into a suborbital trajectory, and it could extend its range around the world by essentially skipping off the atmosphere like a rock.
A group of rocketeers are organized and funded by Goering, with research and development to be done at the Hermann Göring Institute, located north of Hanover.
Hermann Göring was involved in rocketry, and he saw what the Army was doing with the V1, the V2, and he said, "Hey, I think I should be involved in this as well." So he started his own group of rocketeers, men who he could find who hadn't been picked up and picked over by Dornberger.
So he started to invent and manufacture power plants, and these were in rocket and pulse jets. And from that, he also designed mini fighters with pulse jets, which then led to the idea that perhaps, we could actually go into the atmosphere and have long distances and bomb United States or whatever.
It is there where Sanger and his future wife, Dr. Irene Brett, a brilliant mathematician, begin working on the Silbervogel. On paper, the aircraft is to be launched from a 2-mile-long sled track where rockets will push the Silverbird to over 5,000 feet in altitude.
The Germans decided to use this to put a little vehicle behind this Sanger ramjet bomber that was just tied to the sled, to the electronic sled, and it would push this Silverbird off into the air at a good clip.
He'd have a 2-mile-long monorail that would be pushed along by probably 2-3 dozen of Werner von Braun's V2 rocket engines. At the end of the monorail, the aircraft is going almost 1,200 miles an hour. Once it reached that speed, it would take off at about a 30-degree angle and go up to about 80 to 90 miles altitude.
When the aircraft's power plant ignites, over 600 tons of thrust is generated in a mere 11 seconds. Climbing to over 130,000 feet, the target for its 1-ton payload are the cities of New York and Washington, D.C. Traveling at hypersonic speed, no existing Allied plane or anti-aircraft artillery can touch this Silbervogel on its voyage halfway across the world. After releasing its bombs, this futuristic aircraft will hopefully land on either Japanese territory or on the deck of a U-boat submarine. It is a grand concept, a project that requires years, if not decades, of research and development and vast sums of money in order to complete. Ironically, one of the Silverbird's biggest flaws comes from Sanger himself.
He had a habit, when he ever come up against a problem which he couldn't solve immediately, he would move on to something else. So consequently, Sanger investigated a lot of things, but he jumped around. He jumped from one idea to another, to another, to another.
In studying its design, those in the top German hierarchy have many questions surrounding the aircraft's rocket engine.
With the Silverbird being rocket-powered, there's no plan B for it. Once you ignite the engine, it runs until it runs out of fuel. And you have to, it takes you wherever you have to go, and that's the end. With the supersonic transport, like the Concorde or the SST, I mean, you can turn, you can land, you can refuel, but you could not do that with Sanger's Silverbird. And so, feasible, yes; practical, no.
Also, legitimate concerns are raised about the project's feasibility in a time of war.
The hypersonic vehicle requires an incredibly difficult exotic metal structure in order not to melt. And then you would have the trajectory problem of skipping off the atmosphere is difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. So essentially it was a completely utopian concept for the Third Reich.
This thing flies so high and so fast that how would you even drop the bomb knowing where to drop it and where it's going to hit? For example, the Silverbird, if it went around the world, and that's what it was designed to do, leave Berlin, fly around the world, and on the opposite pole would be New York City. You'd have to drop the bomb somewhere in Iowa. Iowa to New York City is a long, long distance.
He is a visionary, but not a practical man. While the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket are thoroughly tested on Peenemünde during the war years, the Silverbird is never able to get past the drawing board.
But it was all really fantastic futuristic ideas which in today's world could be realised. But they were so far ahead of their time that Germany didn't have the capability in terms of facilities, equipment, the technology even was still only on the drawing board. And it would have taken a lot of experimentation to actually realise the ideas.
I mean, this was a paper proposal, and I think in so many of the enthusiast, Nazi exotic weapons concepts that the enthusiasts love, have failed to see just how beyond the technology of the time. I mean, it would be a difficult thing to carry out today, let alone in the 1940s.
By 1942, with the war going in Germany's favour, the Silbervogel is cancelled indefinitely. As the Third Reich faces attacks on two fronts, cuts need to be made, and an enormously expensive space plane is one of them.
Around 1941-42, the Luftwaffe lost interest in this whole utopian project of Sanger, because Sanger wanted to scale up his effort to build a major rocket engine and so forth for his airplane. And that was beyond the ability of the Luftwaffe to commit, especially as the war situation got more and more difficult. And there was essentially a contradiction between spending a lot of money on Sanger for rocket development when there was already a huge rocket project in Germany, the von Braun Peenemünde project.
With the Silverbird's termination, Sanger and Brett are assigned to work on developing ramjet technology for the fatherland. The aircraft appears to be all but dead. 3 years after the project's cancellation, Germany surrenders to the Allies. With both sides closing in from the east and west, Nazi scientists who worked on the Third Reich's wonder weapons become highly sought-after bounty. In the United States, Operation Paperclip is enacted in order to bring these men to America to begin work in their own defense industries. The same people who developed the deadly V-2 rocket that killed thousands during the Second World War now have their slate wiped clean as they begin their new lives, working for their one-time enemy. With tensions escalating as the Soviet Union becomes America's biggest adversary, they will need every advantage possible in order to defeat a regime that soon will possess both the atomic bomb and a delivery system capable of reaching the cities that Germany could never touch. Surprisingly, while hundreds of scientists are rounded up and sent to both sides of the Iron Curtain, Sanger and his wife, Irene Brett, go to neither superpower. Instead, they travel to France to restart their failed research.
Anybody who was picked up by the Soviets post-World War II, for example, if Sanger had been picked up by the Soviets, he had been squeezed like a lemon in order to get whatever knowledge and technology ideas he had out of him. He didn't want to go to the Soviet Union. Now, Sanger did not want to come to America in Operation Paperclip. In fact, he was never invited. Sanger was that small group of scientists in Nazi Germany who felt betrayed that the Americans had beat them, had defeated Nazi Germany, and that they were still mad, still angry with the Americans. And so Sanger, along with a few others, said, I'm not going to work for the Americans. I will not go to America. I'll go to France, where there's a more friendly work environment, and that's where I'm going to continue my career.
With the Soviet victory in 1945, its army begins capturing detailed blueprints of numerous German designs being worked on during the war.
When the Soviets overran Berlin, they overran the Reich's Luftwaffe Ministerium building, and they copied every aircraft design that the Germans had proposed and were proposing to build post-World War II. They had all of these documents translated into Russian, so they knew every aircraft that Germany was working on or was thinking about in the future.
One plane in particular catches the eye of Joseph Stalin.
Stalin seized upon the idea about 1946-47 and was interested in funding it, and because it seemed like the magic answer to figuring out how to attack the United States.
The Soviets wanted Sanger. The Cold War was starting, and they thought, well, maybe one day we're going to have to bomb America, or maybe one day we'll have to bomb Australia. Maybe one day we'll have to bomb any other country around the world. Now, according to the documents that we have here, Sanger's suborbital rocket bomber could bomb any location in around the world. So they said, Stalin says, we got to find Sanger.
The Silverbird, with all of its unique advantages on paper, appears to be an ideal weapon to use against the United States. And for that reason, he orders a Soviet espionage team headed personally by Stalin's son to kidnap Sanger and bring him to the Soviet Union. The attempt fails miserably.
Well, Sanger was tucked away in France, and although Vasily Stalin could travel all over Europe, he was more of a playboy. He'd go to Paris, and he enjoyed the ladies of the night. He drank heavily, and so it got to the point where he was more interested in the cities he visited and the enjoyment he found than finding Sanger.
It is suspected that the communists lose interest in Sanger's ideas, as they discover in the same way that German scientists did that Sanger's plane is unachievable. On the other side of the world, where interest in spaceflight is reaching all-time highs, German scientist Walter Dornberger, who now is working for Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, attempts to recruit Sanger, the same man who Dornberger criticized as a hopeless dreamer.
There was fascination in the United States with Sanger's Silverbird concept, hypersonic flight rocket planes in the 1950s specifically.
His crowning achievement can be seen in America's X-20 Dinosaur, incorporating a similar principle to that of his Silverbird design. A revolutionary spaceplane built during the Cold War, it is ultimately cancelled in 1963 due to both money and logistical problems. What becomes the beginning of the end for Eugen Sanger is his decision to go to work for Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptians, developing missile technology. When it is discovered that an ex-Nazi is working for an Arab nation to defeat the Israelis, he is dealt a fatal blow to his career.
For a short time in the early 60s, he was kind of part of a scandal of, old Nazis and working on rockets for the Egyptians against the Israelis.
He was secretly working for Egyptian President Nasser, helping him design long-range missiles that could be fired at Israel. Well, the Israeli Secret Service found out about this, and Sanger's lucky he was never assassinated by these people because they were ruthless. Well, anyway, Sanger was alleged to be earning $500,000 a year from President Nasser. And word got back to German officials, and they didn't know what to do about it. Now, Germany at the time, West Germany, was seeking admission into NATO. And they didn't want any kind of conflict. They didn't want any kind of thing that was embarrassing. They wanted a smooth transition. So they decided that Sanger had to go.
Sanger would spend his final years in exile, dying in 1964.
I had talked with Sanger's son, Hartmut Sanger, several years ago, about this time when he was fired by the German government. Sanger lost all interest virtually in his work, didn't publish, didn't write, didn't speak. He ended up being a broken man, and Hartmut Sanger, his son, said that what had happened to him was the cause of his early death at 59 years of age.
In summing up the career of Eugen Sanger, one can describe him as a utopian visionary, unable to turn his ideas into something concrete in the same way Wernher von Braun was able to do with the V-2 rocket.
Well, Sanger is certainly an important visionary of the 1920s and 1930s, with some influence on future concepts for hypersonic flight on rocket airplanes, reentry technology. He has influence. He's not technologically, little of what he did actually played out in something familiar that actually got built.
His inability to see things through would relegate his career to that of a theoretician, unable to capture the headlines the same way his colleagues were able to. At the same time, his contribution to rocket technology, to ramjets, to the lifting body, to skip trajectory, and to hypersonic flight can never be ignored. Had his Silverbird been completed, its impact would have been monumental to whatever country possessed the weapon. For that reason, Dr. Eugen Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen, is in the history books as one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century.
In 1938, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring declares, "I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York with a 5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea." 4 years after that statement is made, the nation of Germany begins to feel the industrial strength of America firsthand. Bombers begin pounding the Nazi regime day after day with attacks from England. With the United States means of production out of reach, any hope of retaliation seems impossible. Little do American leaders know that 3 planes are being developed in order to do just that. Messerschmitt 264, Junkers 390, and Focke-Wulf TA-400 are being rushed into production to make it across the Atlantic in order to reciprocate this destruction. It is a project cloaked in secrecy for more than 70 years. Many details are sketchy, based on hearsay and unsubstantiated claims. Now take an in-depth look at both the planes and the possibilities they represented. Could they have tipped the scale in favor of the Axis so late in the war? Could they have actually made it across the ocean and back without refueling? Explore alongside historians and experts the story of the Amerika bombers. On December the 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war against the United States of America. Ever since the Second World War has begun, the two nations have been battling it out unofficially in the Atlantic Ocean.
Hitler probably declares war on the United States because there's already an undeclared war going on against the United States of America. In the North Atlantic, with U.S. destroyers, U-boats. So he may think it's simply inevitable. But whether he thinks it's inevitable or not, it probably wasn't, and it's a terrible mistake on his part.
We came in the war because of the Japanese, because of Hitler's stupid agreement with the Japanese. And he lived up to his agreement, but it really did cost him the war. If he'd never made the alliance with Japan, we might be doing this interview in German.
Before Pearl Harbor, America supplies the Allies with war materials, causing its ships and German U-boats to clash as a result.
It is quite clear that the United States had broken their neutrality at least 6 months before Pearl Harbor by assisting the British in getting the convoys from the United States to Britain safely and without being attacked by German submarines. So there was actually this warlike activity already in existence between American destroyers and German submarines without there being a public state of war.
Just prior to Pearl Harbor, there are a series of incidents in the North Atlantic. 3 destroyers are involved in altercations with German U-boats. The Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And there's an escalation with each one. And with the Kearney, it's merely an exchange of fire. There's a torpedo fired at the Greer after a U.S. plane takes a shot at the submarine. With the Kearney, the ship is actually hit with a loss of U.S. life. And with the Reuben James, that is sunk. And Roosevelt points to this as a reason for increased vigilance and activity against the Nazis. And it's a question of who fires first and all that.
For Hitler, the decision is an easy one. The United States will no longer be considered neutral. The gloves can finally come off. Its shipping capabilities are now fair game for German submarines. Once victory is declared over the Soviet Union, America and Britain will sue for peace. That is the Nazi plan. In less than a year, however, the exact opposite happens. Fighting against both Japan and Germany, the arsenal of democracy only grows stronger.
The Americans again had the resources, they had the industry, they had the time, and this huge industry that could produce trainers, fighters, light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, patrol bombers, any type of aircraft you can think of, and the tanks, and the trucks, and produce the gasoline, and the munitions, and everything else, and the ships, huge navy. They could do all of that at the same time. The Germans couldn't.
Factories begin turning out a plane every 5 minutes, and a ship every day.
American factories were in 24/7 production by the end of 1942, and in 43 and 44, not only armed one of the largest militaries in the world, but armed our allies as well, the British, the Soviet Union. In the course of the war, we gave somewhere around 50,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, 15,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft.
The United States has a unique advantage due to its geography. It does not have to worry about planes bombing their factories. It can go on producing at an unprecedented level.
America never really gets out of the Great Depression until World War II comes along. The unemployment figures were as high as 14-17% in the late 1930s, and they really don't start to drop until America becomes the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Allies and shipping literally billions of dollars overseas. The Lend-Lease program ultimately is $50 billion by itself, which in the dollars of today is about $800 billion, a tremendous stimulus package for the American economy.
They were delivering huge numbers of aircraft and tanks and vehicles, trucks, etc. to the British and the Canadians and the Australians, etc. So they were a major producer of weapons for the Allies.
And having 2 oceans protecting its civilian population, the American people are confident that they're providing materials that will shift the balance of power away from the Axis.
Economists say the natural resources of the United Nations are greater, but the capacity of the Axis to turn what resources they have into weapons of war is tremendous. They have the mighty Krupp munitions works. We have Birmingham. They have Skoda. We have Delaware. They have factories like this in occupied France. England has Vickers. They seized the steel mills of Luxembourg. We have Pittsburgh. They have great factories to turn out Heinkels, Messerschmitts, Dorniers. We turn out flying Fortresses, P-38s, P-40s, Aerocobras, Tomahawks, many others. Romanian oil drives their planes and tanks. Oil from the fields of Oklahoma, Texas, and California will drive our planes and tanks.
For German leaders, the United States poses a serious dilemma. With more than 5,000 miles separating the two countries, no existing German aircraft can even come close to reaching America's east coast. In early 1942, the only strategy available to Nazi war planners is unrestricted submarine warfare.
One of the most successful weapons that the Nazis had was the U-boat fleet, the U-boat service, the Kriegsmarine, which is essentially, by the end of the war, a U-boat navy. They were in 1942. They were wildly successful. It looked like they were going to just win the war just by sinking everything in the Atlantic.
A plan known as Operation Drumbeat begins with U-boats torpedoing America's shores, sinking millions of tons of shipping.
Well, the Americans, of course, were very much surprised by the immediate reaction of, or action, not reaction, by German submarines after the war has been declared by Germany. Germany at that particular time sent a group of submarines over to the American coast, and America was totally unprepared for that kind of assault. And the German submarines over there found absolutely no opposition whatsoever, and it was partly a Turkish shoot for them. The ships were illuminated; they were not in convoys. The cities were not blacked out, so it was partly for them almost a peacetime-like exercise they did, and of course they were very, very successful in doing so, and put America into a state of shock from which it took them many, many months to recover.
Operation Drumbeat, or Paukenschlag in the original German, was the first U-boat offensive against the east coast of the United States. And to say that it was a happy time for the U-boats and their crews is understating the case considerably. And in fact, many of them did look back on it as those who survived the war look back on 1942 as just kind of a happy hunting time. It takes all modern nations some time to gear up into a war posture, and it might take democracies longer than dictatorships, and it might take our fractious and argumentative democracy in America even longer than some. And certainly the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and we were at war a couple of days later, but it's not to say we took it with the seriousness that it deserves. And something as simple as blacking out cities on the East Coast was policies and procedures would have to be drawn up. It's not simply a case of everyone in New York turning out their lights at the same time. Now, with illuminated cities along the East Coast, every single American transport which sailed from harbor was nicely silhouetted against a bright background of lights. And U-boat and submarine commanders just could not have had a juicier or more lucrative target. And these experienced crews took advantage of it, sinking somewhere around 2 million tons of shipping in 1942.
Caught off guard, it takes time for American war planners to augment their strategy in dealing with this submarine menace. Through the use of a convoy system, as well as ordering mandatory blackouts, Operation Drumbeat fades away.
The turning point can be placed at early 1943, in May, I think, when we lost about 40 boats in 1 month or something like that.
By 1943, materials and supplies begin reaching Britain with little interruption. Once on English soil, their impact is felt immediately. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators begin flying over the heart of Germany. Alongside British planes, the fatherland is bombed mercilessly.
The offensive continues in greater and greater strength.
Well, certainly German industries took a pounding. German civilians took a pounding. Winston Churchill probably put it best when he once said that the air effort was dehousing the German people, destroying their living quarters one building at a time.
Cities are turned into rubble. And with Soviet victories on the Eastern Front, the Allied powers begin closing in on the Axis. Hitler, seeing the destruction firsthand, is outraged at these bombings. However, with his U-boats neutralized and the United States out of reach, there's little Nazi generals can do to fight back against the American war machine. What is needed is a wonder weapon to enact revenge. Beginning as early as the interwar period, German war planners study a hypothetical attack on the United States.
Dornberger, assisted by Werner von Braun, had been thinking about some kind of a rocket-propelled weapon that could attack the United States as far back as 1937. There was a weapon that they were designing called variously either the New York bomb or the American rocket. It had an interesting intent. They would take a massive, massive booster rocket, put a V2 at the top of it, fire it off, and the V2 would eventually attain speeds of 6,000 miles an hour, which meant that it could cross the Atlantic in something like 40 minutes. It could strike New York, it could strike Washington, it could strike Boston.
Of course, you can never laugh these things off because Germans were so innovative that sometimes they achieved things which to many minds were quite impossible.
The Germans were never able to launch any sort of attack on the continental United States. That's not to say they didn't talk about it, they didn't plan on doing it, and they didn't drop various schemes for doing it, some relatively realistic and some much more fanciful.
Many concepts are examined and many are rejected due to their technological limitations.
There was the notion, for example, of launching a V-1, the so-called buzz bomb, in some ways the distant ancestor of our modern cruise missile, of launching a V-1 from a ramp on the deck of a U-boat that had surfaced off of the American coast. Now, of course, the problem of getting a German U-boat to the American coast with a large ramp and a buzz bomb on top of it was never really dealt with.
Some of these ideas even border on the realm of a science fiction novel.
Likewise, there was a plan for towing a V-2. Now, the V-2 being the not-so-distant ancestor of the post-World War II intercontinental ballistic missile, of taking a V-2, encasing it in its own missile launcher, and then putting it into position on the back of a U-boat. The launcher would swing into a vertical position, that is a launch position, and thus then launch the weapon against an American city, presumably New York, and presumably Manhattan. Now, the problems with such a plan, of course, include getting, once again, that V-2 over the Atlantic Ocean, crawling with U.S. naval vessels of various shapes and sizes, not to mention our own submarine fleet, and doing so while trailing an extremely heavy and extremely obvious 118-foot-long canister without being detected.
The most realistic and achievable weapon is a long-range bomber.
In 1939, things in Europe were not going too well, and war clouds were beginning to erupt. It was then that Hitler realized, and some of the hierarchy in the Luftwaffe realized, that they may need something that could fly a little bit further than what they originally conceived. So they put out a specification to try and get a bomber that might reach the United States.
Attacking the American East Coast with raids the same way the B-17 is attacking the fatherland.
The Germans were very intent on finding some way that they could strike the United States by air. Besides having worked on rocketry, they were also developing a bomber.
So the Germans realized that at one point, if you wanted to stop or at least put a brake on the production effort in the US, you would have to put some threat over their head. The only way to do that would be to bomb them.
Unfortunately for the Nazis, it's a goal that's difficult at best. For a plan like this to work, it must reach America and back without refueling.
The problem that the Germans faced in building a long-range bomber is long-range. It had to go across the Atlantic, bomb New York City, maybe a little slack time there in case they ran into some fighters or something, and then it had to turn around nonstop without landing and fly back to Norway or the west coast of France. Which this is a long trip, and nobody does this today. You're 747 doesn't do this today. They'll land in Europe or in England and refuel and check the plane out. They couldn't do this. The Germans couldn't do this. They had no way to land. So if you're going to do this in a round-trip fashion, you have to have a truly intercontinental bomber. And this is something the United States didn't have until the B-36, which was 1949, 1950.
Their best chance is with the Bachem Voss 222 flying boat. But the odds of it making it back to the fatherland are slim to none.
Well, I flew the 222, and I would certainly agree it could get to within range of the American coast. It was a pretty impressive flying boat. I do not believe that they could ever have attacked the American coast and got away with it, because though it had this tremendous range and it was nice, quite nice to fly, got quite light handling controls, it was very vulnerable to a fighter attack. And I just don't see it surviving any attack by any fighter at all, frankly.
12,000 miles would be needed in order to strike. No plane during this time can even come close in covering a distance this size. The Germans' longest-range bomber, the Heinkel 177, is encountering numerous problems with its unworkable tandem engine arrangement.
They didn't really get around to building 4-engine bombers, and when they did, it was an off and on type of thing. So one general actually was fired over this idea that he didn't come up with a 4-engine bomber later on in the war, Ernst Udet. He was marginalized and then committed suicide, probably over this very issue.
A plane of this magnitude must instead be designed from scratch.
But they realized it would have to be a very long-range bomber. For all intended purposes, you're looking at the German equivalent of the B-29.
And in order for it to work, an enormous amount of time and material is needed for production, development, and testing, something the Germans are lacking by this time.
There were lies about the stocks of aluminium available. Production had not been rationalized. Civilian resources had not been mobilized. And there was still a belief on the part of fighter pilots that quality was what mattered and that you would only get that by producing aircraft in relatively small numbers. So mass production was avoided. In 1944, Britain alone had 12 factories that employed more than 10,000 people. Germany only had 2.
Despite these roadblocks, Adolf Hitler, having a fascination with wonder weapons, enthusiastically gives a green light to the project. The Amerika bombers are born. To provide a buffer of relief, Nazi planners believe they have a perfect halfway point. The Azores, an archipelago of 9 islands located 900 miles east off neutral Portugal, is ideal for a project of this nature.
Now they realized that the distances were huge. Actually, that's why they considered using the Azores as a base. It's halfway across, not quite halfway across the Atlantic, but it's certainly closer than bombing from bases in France. So there was definitely an interest there.
In 1940, after the fall of France, Admiral Raeder strongly urged Hitler to occupy them before the Americans could get to the islands first.
At one time, it was speculated, even Hitler suggested, that perhaps they should invade the Azores and take over the Azores and use it as a jumping off point for their long-range aircraft to fly to the States.
Now, if German planes are given permission to land the same way German U-boats are allowed to dock, this geostrategic area would be worth its weight in gold. Having the range requirements significantly reduced, the plan to bomb America now appears more feasible than ever. What is needed now are targets. In order to cripple the arsenal of democracy, these hypothetical German planes cannot just bomb indiscriminately. They instead must go right after their means of production, attacking factories that are building the planes and bombs that are ruining German cities. Prepared by the War Department in April of 1942, a 33-page document lists 21 potential targets for the Germans to attack. the Aluminum Company of America, located in Messina, New York, the Chrysler Corporation in Detroit, the Wright Aeronautical Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and many others are the destinations for the Amerika bombers. The targets and the takeoff are set. In looking for companies to build these super bombers, the Nazi regime goes to the very best.
They came up with some designs. Of course, every builder would come up with, every aircraft manufacturer would come up with a design, and they would take a look at the designs on paper and select one.
Messerschmitt, makers of the Me-109 and the 110, two planes that battled Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. It's also the company that's working on the revolutionary Me-262, the first jet-powered aircraft. Beginning in the late 1930s, Messerschmitt begins dabbling in what is known as Secret Project P-1061. Its requirements are for an aircraft capable of reaching bases in Central Africa as well as Vichy French territories. Now, the plan calls for a plane that can reach the United States, carrying a payload of 5,000 kilograms.
Messerschmitt came up with an idea that got off the ground, the Messerschmitt 264, and they originally wanted something like 6 prototypes for testing. And if these were proved successful, then they were going to build a fleet of them.
Awarded the contract by the German government, workers at Messerschmitt begin working on the aircraft known as the Me-264. Different versions are considered, and once the plane begins taking shape, it starts to look eerily similar to another design that's being constructed across the ocean.
So by and large, there were designs. I think there was a Messerschmitt 264, which looks a little bit like a B-29.
The 264 was actually quite an interesting aeroplane design. It had a circular fuselage section, which in stress terms was very, very good, because the circle has equal stress points. It was built over a long period of time, and it didn't actually fly until 1942.
Originally designed with 4 BMW 801G engines, German officials hope that a 6-engine version will be in the skies as early as the fall of 1943. However, designers are noticing that the first prototype of the aircraft has a very high wing load. This is resulting in a loss of maneuverability, an unimpressive climb rate, and in-flight instability. 2 more prototypes are to be tested, one with armaments and one that is to be fully completed. However, with the aircraft being years away from flying, alternative designs and designers are sought out. Junkers, makers of the Stuka dive bomber and the Ju-52 transport plane, present their vision of a transoceanic aircraft capable of bombing Uncle Sam. The company is highly favoured amongst top Luftwaffe officials when it's taken over by the government in 1935, following the death of its founder, Hugo Junkers. Having overseen the company's nationalisation personally, Field Marshal Erhard Milch leans towards the alternative. One of their planes already on the books is the Ju-290, an evolution of an earlier design with a greater wingspan, used for long-range maritime reconnaissance and bringing supplies to German soldiers, most notably during their encirclement at Stalingrad.
The 290 had the advantage of having a roll-on, roll-off capacity for equipment, because it had a rear door that could be dropped. And that was the big advantage. You didn't need to have trucks to load it and unload it. You could actually drive on and drive off. And that was the major advantage of the 290.
The train of thought now is to just enlarge this aircraft for bombing America. The result is the Ju-390, a plane with 6 1,700 horsepower engines, a wingspan of 181 feet, and a fuselage that is even longer than the American B-29.
Junkers were actually adapting their Ju-290 aircraft into the Ju-390, which was actually a 6-engined aircraft. And a lot of people, especially the German Navy, thought that would be quite a nice aeroplane, and others thought that yes, it would make a very nice Amerika bomber.
The Ju-390 was a similar situation. There were two built that we know of. One was given to Hans Bauer, the Hitler's pilot. So it was for Hitler's use, for state use. So Hitler had a 390.
Built at the Junkers factory in Dessau, the first prototype is able to make its maiden flight in August of 1943.
They had high hopes for this bomber, and between this and the Messerschmitt 264, it looks like that much time, or if not in total time, these were controlled by the SS.
Despite its early success, the Nazi hierarchy still wants an insurance policy. On August the 11th, 1938, the nation of Germany makes history when a Focke-Wulf Condor arrives in New York City after a rigorous 24-hour flight across the Atlantic.
There was still this belief in the USA that they were very safe, and isolationism was still very, very rife there, and that any kind of invasion from abroad would have been almost impossible. However, in 1938 an event occurred which changed all that. This was that on the 10th of August 1938, a Focke-Wulf 200 took off from Berlin-Staaken and flew right across the Atlantic and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in New York after a 24-hour, 59-minute flight, non-stop. This put the wind up. Senior military people who suddenly realized that they weren't quite as safe as they thought.
Having proved itself capable of flying long distances, the aircraft goes to work during the war, providing reconnaissance for U-boat operations.
The Focke-Wulf 200, it was of course the civil Condor at one stage, and then it was militarized to become the Courier. And in fact, as the Courier, it was very successful as a reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic. It was very heavily armed, and it had a wide range, and where it did the damage was it could operate beyond fighter range from England or from Britain.
Now, the plan is to evolve the Condor the same way that the 290 is being evolved. The result is the TA-400, consisting of 6 BMW 1700 horsepower engines. Just to keep this monster up in the air, an unprecedented 32 fuel tanks, capable of carrying 7,000 gallons of gasoline, are put on board the aircraft. Possessing a pressurized cockpit, 2 remote-controlled turrets, 20mm cannons, and a payload of 22,000 pounds. The third of the Amerika bombers appears to be the deadliest. As Germany struggles to find a way to attack the United States, many options are looked at. Submarines, space rockets, and espionage are appealing, but the most realistic strategy by 1942 is a long-range bomber. 3 companies, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf, all bring their designs to the table and begin working on planes that can render a decisive blow against America.
Russia did not actually capitulate. And in the winter of 1941, it actually launched a counterattack in front of Moscow. And there began a phase of the war which was to last more or less till its end. It was a war of attrition, a war eventually to be on 2 fronts, precisely the war the Germans always knew they couldn't win.
By 1944, the tide has turned in favor of the Allies.
Beginning in 1943, the American Air Force and the RAF, the British Air Force, were mounting 1,000-plane raids against Germany. By 1944, these raids were creating havoc in Germany. 3 raids against the city of Hamburg resulted in something like 50,000 German dead. The cities in Germany were being destroyed, leveled at the rate of something like 2 a month.
While the principles of war remained unchanged, the use of new weapons revised the concept of war. This time, Germany was faced with a weapon that leaped over battle lines and frontiers and smashed at the ultimate enemy, the German worker, who equipped and fed the German soldier. This time, the enemy nation was physically destroyed before its defending army was defeated.
But as the Allies came to rely increasingly on a strategy of strategic air power as a way of bringing Germany low, the need became pressing for some sort of escort fighter, and of course that need was met in the P-51.
The P-38 was available at first, then the P-47. Neither had the range to be able to escort the bombers all the way from England to Germany and back. The P-51 was the first that could do that. So now you had bombers flying raids all the way into the heart of Germany, even as far as Berlin, being able to have a very effective fighter escort the whole way there and back.
In England, Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, is being planned by both British and American generals for later that year.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters so far. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by them. So, I mean, you know, it had a huge effect, I think, on the whole course of the war, of being able to bring the fight directly to the German tactical aviation forces.
For a Germany in its last throes, they begin turning to the secret weapons they have invested so much time and money into as the saviors that can strike a knockout blow.
The Holy Grail was a weapon of mass destruction. And they had gone the road of the nuclear, hoping to get the nuclear bomb. They had gone the road of the V1 and the V2. But they were always, as I say, searching for that Holy Grail.
August of 1944, Hitler and Mussolini met in Germany. Mussolini took a train to Germany, and they had a little heart-to-heart talk. Mussolini said to Hitler, look, I've been deposed once, I've been reinstalled in northern Germany, or northern Italy. The Allies are in Italy. The Allies are closing in, the Russians are closing in from the east. It's August of 1944, and what guarantee do I have, if I still throw in my cards with you, Adolf Hitler, that you can actually pull this war out, because it's not looking good now. And Hitler said to Mussolini in so many words, I have some wonder weapons coming.
In Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe is working overtime, getting the V1 flying bomb ready to launch. And if this device fails, the revolutionary V2 rocket is going to strike the fear of God into the Allies, being the predecessor of today's intercontinental ballistic missile.
The V1 and the V2 were extremely important in terms of later weapons development. The V2, of course, a single glance at it will make clear that it is the ancestor of the later ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. But perhaps even more than that for most Americans, it is clearly the ancestor of our NASA effort to reach space.
The target for both these weapons is London, where no one will be spared. Britain's ally, the United States, is also set to receive a deadly dose of a different type of wonder weapon.
The Americans were using Great Britain as an aircraft carrier to bomb Germany. Bombing England or bombing London alone, the British may have said no more, but there's no guarantee that the Americans were even going to let them do that at this point. They were so intent upon crushing Germany, and they had the Russians moving in from the east. So for a lot of political reasons, you have to stop this at the source. So the Germans were interested in bombing New York City, number 1, Moscow, number 2, and London, number 3.
In order to strike fear across the Atlantic, the Amerika bombers are being hurried along. As development continues, the Nazi leadership is hoping to get at least one of these planes across the ocean to deliver a fatal blow.
The Junker 390, which was tested in a flight that managed to remain aloft for something like 12,000 miles, which would easily have made a round trip to the United States. And one of the practice runs they ran within 12 miles of the U.S. coast. The Germans even had another bomber in their plans, and that was a Messerschmitt plane, the ME-264. It was also tested and very likely could have struck the United States.
If this plan proves successful, the psychological impact could be the German equivalent of the Doolittle raid.
Yeah, the targets for the ME-264 would obviously have been preferred to be military targets. But the propaganda value of simply dropping a few bombs on New York would have had an amazing effect both in the USA and on the morale in Germany. In the USA, it would have no doubt caused a lot of panic and created a lot of defensive maneuvers within the East Coast because they didn't know if and when the bombers could come back.
In bombing the United States, the Germans saw that they could politically damage the United States, damage the American leadership so much that the Americans would reconsider their quest for total victory. In other words, that the Germans could do a deal. The Germans could do an armistice on the Western Front and perhaps keep fighting the Soviets. They really didn't like the Soviets. The Americans and the British they didn't, that wasn't part of the bargain when they started the war. They really didn't, they looked upon us as more of a nuisance that got to festered and became a huge problem for them. So they would have always liked to just do away with us and continue fighting the Soviets.
As intelligence leaks, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill begin to worry about the secret weapons Germany might have in store for them.
Franklin Roosevelt was very conscious of the capacity of German science. And indeed, in 1944, in December of that year, one of his agents who was posted in Turkey, which was a hotbed of international espionage, reported to him that the Germans had mastered another weapon called the V3, and that it was capable of attacking the United States. Now, Roosevelt took this threat seriously. In fact, he confided to one of his people that he understood that a single bomb launched in this method could destroy a United States city. So he put the East Coast on alert when this attack presumably was going to happen. Obviously, it did not occur, but it pointed out the potential of German science.
If resources are diverted, England will be softened up for the eventual launchings of the V1 and the V2. The only thing that Germany does not have on its side is time. By 1944, as the Amerika bombers are being developed, Germany remains in a weakened state. Being pounded into submission day and night by Allied planes taking off from the coast of England, and with the Soviet Union moving in from the east, it's no longer an if, but when the Nazis will surrender. Their factories cannot continue unless a dramatic reversal of fortune occurs. Only a miracle weapon can save them, which along with the V1 and the V2 is hopefully the planes designed to pulverize Uncle Sam. However, just as the project begins to develop, the dominoes begin to fall, lessening the chances that one of these planes will make it up into the skies before it's too late. The first of these is the decision by the Portuguese government to lease the Azores bases to the Allies. Sensing which direction the war is going in, the neutral nation turns away from the German plan to launch the Amerika bombers from their territory. This key strategic site, where the Third Reich planned to base these planes, is now only a distant memory. As German cities and industries crumble, Luftwaffe officials are forced to make drastic cuts. In many respects, the Amerika bombers are typical of the hundreds of secret projects being mismanaged that become the Achilles heel of the Luftwaffe.
Right up to the last day of the war, they were working on 138 different guided missile projects. How can a nation which is on its knees be expending effort like this? Fortunately for us, they were expending this sort of effort through total mismanagement and lack of control of their resources.
And one of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended. This took place throughout the war, compared to, for example, U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
Only 3 Me-264s had actually been ordered, out of which only 1 was realised, and the other 2 were still in small parts, and nothing really serious was taking place there. And then out the blue, the RLM, the German Air Ministry, asked if they could produce 30 Me-264s. But then everybody realised that where would they build them, how would they build them, and from what would they build them? It was really the boat had been missed on any of that.
The resources, the time, the crews, the ground support equipment, the bases, because you can't base aircraft of that size on a grass field. You need all the infrastructure. You have to get the bombs to the base. You have to get the fuel to the base, and not just once. You have to get the fuel coming back constantly, day after day after day. It's a huge infrastructure that the Americans and the British had to put up in Great Britain. The UK was a giant service station. It's hundreds, thousands of aircraft had to be refueled constantly. That infrastructure did not exist in occupied Europe for a large bomber force. Because sending 2 aircraft every week, what's the point?
With resources strained, planes still in their design stage are now in the crosshairs. One aircraft that's on the chopping block is Focke-Wulf's TA-400. After assessing its design and noticing it requires more labour and materials than the Me-264, the decision to cancel it is made in late 1943.
They investigated and then realised that to actually build it and make it fly would take so many years that it was just impractical to even consider the project as being feasible.
Even as the prototype of the Ju-390 proves to be feasible, by mid-1944 all orders of that plane and the 290 are cancelled.
Again, it would have taken a vast amount of space and material and everything to build. And it really, the performance of the 390 didn't come up to what was expected. So that idea didn't go any further, although the German Navy quite liked the aeroplane.
Now, the only hope is with Messerschmitt.
One was destroyed on the ground. The program was canceled, as all German programs were. It's a start-stop attitude. So it may have been started and stopped several times.
Because of the changing situation of the war, and people had lots of ideas for strategic bombing. One day they were for it, the next day they were against it, and specifications were sort of being issued left, right and centre. Messerschmitt actually did produce a large number of projected modifications to his 264, but none of them ever came to any fruition. I mean, there were ideas to attach huge fuel tanks to the airplanes, which could be 600-gallon fuel tanks, carried externally. Also, a 6-engine version was proposed. But all this was real pie-in-the-sky stuff, because none of it could really be achieved at that time of the war. Things were really starting to go bad for Germany, and a lot of this stuff was just panic measures, trying to sort of clutch things out of the air, which really were just not possible.
With the continued bombardment causing a severe strain on the country's resources, Erhard Milch decides to stall production of the 264 and instead focus on the 262. The priority now is defense, and the hope is that this jet fighter bomber can shoot down the flying fortresses that have been pounding them into submission. That same year, several Allied bombing raids on the Messerschmitt factories damage all of the 264s beyond repair. By October of that year, the aircraft is cancelled indefinitely. All of these factors combined spell doom for the Amerika bombers.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In the more than 60 years since the Nazi regime was destroyed, many questions surrounding the Amerika bombers program remain unsolved.
When we interrogated William Messerschmitt, he pooh-poohed it as if, I really had nothing to do with it. I think they realized they were going down a blind alley with that, really.
For a project cloaked in secrecy, rampant rumours begin spreading in the decades following VE Day. One such rumour is the assertion that the Ju-390 successfully made a reconnaissance flight of approximately 12,000 miles from occupied France to New York Harbor.
The fact that Juncker's Ju-390 came within 12 miles of New York is something that's said by many sources. It's not just one source. This isn't a wild and crazy guy saying this. This is something that is said and repeated, and I believe to be true.
A hypothetical question asked is, what impact would these planes have had if they were successful in carrying out bombing raids on American cities?
But I would say that even if the Germans could have put 2 or 3 aircraft together that could somehow make that perilous flight across the Atlantic and lob a couple of bombs into lower Manhattan, I think the political impact would have been tremendous. At the very least, President Roosevelt would have been forced to redeploy anti-aircraft assets from Britain, where they were protecting Britain against German air attack, to the continental United States. And that might have had some appreciable impact on the future course of operations in Western Europe.
If the United States had actually suffered on its shores serious damage from German rocketry or from other transoceanic bombers such as they intended, the probably impact on the war would be that it would have been extended. Given the great industrial, innovative powers of the United States as demonstrated in that war by our production, the development of an atom bomb, no doubt we would have struck back, but it certainly would have extended the war to have the destruction brought to our shores.
I wouldn't say a waste of resources, but to a large extent, the hopes of actually curtailing, even annoying the Americans was very small. They might have annoyed them all right, but that would not have been good because the Americans might simply have reacted by bombing the German factories and the bases more fiercely than they did. So in the end, chances are, even that the Germans built the bombers and the bases, they would not have remained in operation very long. They may not even have been completed before they got pulverized.
Would they have been able to crack the well-oiled American war machine by 1945? Would they have been able to weaken civilian morale?
When you look at the effect of the German bombing of England during the Blitz, it's pretty clear it strengthened British resolve. It caused more of a feeling of we've got to get back at those guys rather than fomenting this attitude of, oh, there's no point, we should surrender. So if you're talking about strategic bombing as trying to sap the morale of the enemy, the evidence is pretty clear that doesn't work.
Naturally, the American people probably felt very secure having an entire ocean between ourselves and the war that was raging in Europe. What effect, let's say, on morale would have occurred had they the Germans been able to strike us directly. I think it would have been very likely the parallel with London and Berlin. These places were smashed. Berlin was practically reduced to rubble by 1,000-plane raids, but people kept their chins up. They managed to take it and went on from day to day. I don't believe that the American people would have reacted any way differently.
It's very difficult for people who have not been involved in a war like that, or have not gone through the experience, to understand that war to us had become a condition which to us was no more different than the weather. It was something we had to live with. You could talk about it, but you couldn't do a darn thing about it. And the fact that cities got destroyed or submarines got sunk or whatever, it was just part of war, and we took it very naturally somehow without being as dismayed as we are today when we read history.
The plan to bomb America proved appealing to many in the High Command, an act of revenge against a nation that seemed impregnable. Like many other secret Nazi projects, however, a firm lack of purpose and direction existed. The bureaucracy in place at the time and the continued destruction of German factories and cities guaranteed that aircraft like these, despite their potential, would never get off the ground. Instead, these planes and the men behind them remain a pipe dream, one of the Second World War's greatest what-ifs.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.